Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I think the most extraordinary event which I can recall took place about 5 years ago. I was then still feeling my way. I had declared for business and attended regularly at my office, but I hadn't succeeded in establishing a really profitable connection, and consequently I had a good deal of leisure time on my hands. I've never thought fit to trouble you with the details of my private life. They would be entirely devoid of interest. I must briefly say, however, that I had a numerous circle of acquaintances and was never at a loss as to how to spend my evenings. I was so fortunate as to have friends in most of the ranks of the social order. There's nothing so unfortunate, to my mind, as a specialized circle wherein a certain round of ideas is continually traversed and retraversed. I've always tried to find out new types and persons whose brains contain something fresh to me. One may chance to gain information even from the conversation of city men on an omnibus. Amongst my acquaintance, I knew a young doctor who lived in a far outlying suburb, and I used often to brave the intolerably slow railway journey to have the pleasure of listening to his talk. One night we conversed so eagerly together over our pipes and whiskey that the clock passed unnoticed, and when I glanced up, I realized with a shock that I had just 5 minutes in which to catch the last train. I made a dash for my hat and stick, and jumped out of the house and down the steps, and tore at full speed up the street. It was no good, however. There was a shriek of the engine whistle, and I stood there at the station door and saw far on the long dark line of the embankment a red light shine and vanish, and a porter came down and shut the door with a bang. "How far to London?" I asked him. "A good 9 miles to Waterloo Bridge," and with that he went off. Before me was the long suburban street, its dreary distance marked by rows of twinkling lamps, and the air was poisoned by the faint, sickly smell of burning bricks. It was not a cheerful prospect by any means, and I had to walk through 9 miles of such streets, deserted as those of Pompeii. I knew pretty well what direction to take, so I set out wearily, looking at the stretch of lamps vanishing in perspective, and as I walked, street after street branched off to the right and left, some far-reaching to distances that seemed endless, communicating with other systems of thoroughfare, and some more protoplasmic streets, beginning in orderly fashion with serried 2-story houses, and ending suddenly in a waste and pits and rubbish heaps and fields. Hence the magic had departed. I've spoken of systems of thoroughfare, and I assure you that, walking alone through these silent places, I felt fantasy growing on me, and some glamour of the infinite. There was here, I felt, an immensity as in the outer void of the universe. I passed from unknown to unknown, my way marked by lamps like stars, and on either hand was an unknown world where myriads of men dwelt and slept, street leading into street, as it seemed to world's end. At first, the road by which I was traveling was lined with houses of unutterable monotony, a wall of gray brick pierced by 2 stories of windows, drawn close to the very pavement. But by degrees I noticed an improvement. There were gardens, and these grew larger. The suburban builder began to allow himself a wider scope, and for a certain distance each flight of steps was guarded by twin lines of plaster, and scents of flowers prevailed over the fume of heated bricks. The road began to climb a hill, and looking up a side street, I saw the half-moon rise over plane trees. There, on the other side, was as if a white cloud had fallen, and the air around it was sweetened as with incense. It was a May tree in full bloom. I pressed on stubbornly, listening for the wheels and the clatter of some belated hansom. But into that land of men who go to the city in the morning and return in the evening, the hansom rarely enters, and I'd resigned myself once more to the walk when I suddenly became aware that someone was advancing to meet me along the sidewalk. The man was strolling rather aimlessly, and though the time and place would have allowed for an unconventional style of dress, he was vested in the ordinary frock coat, black tie, and silk hat of civilization. We met each other under the lamp, and, as often happens in this great town, two casual passengers brought face to face found each in the other an acquaintance. "Mr. Mathias, I think," I said. "Quite so. And you are Frank Burton. You know, you're a man with a Christian name, so I won't apologize for my familiarity. But may I ask, where are you going?" I explained the situation to him, saying I had traversed the region as unknown to me as the darkest recesses of Africa. "I think I only have about 5 miles farther," I concluded. "Nonsense. You must come home with me. My house is close by. In fact, I was just taking my evening walk when we met. Come along. I dare say you will find a makeshift bed easier than a 5-mile walk." I let him take my arm and lead me along, though I was a good deal surprised at so much geniality from a man who was, after all, a mere casual club acquaintance. I suppose I had not spoken to Mr. Mathias half a dozen times. He was a man who would sit silent in the armchair for hours, neither reading nor smoking, but now and again moistening his lips with his tongue and smiling queerly to himself. I confess he had never attracted me, and on the whole I should have preferred to continue my walk. But he took my arm and led me up a side street and stopped at a door in a high wall. We passed through the still moonlit garden, beneath the black shadow of an old cedar, and into an old red brick house with many gables. I was tired enough, and I sighed with relief as I let myself fall into the great leather armchair. You know the infernal grit with which they strew the sidewalk in those suburban districts? It makes walking a penance, and I felt my 4-mile tramp had made me more weary than 10 miles on an honest country road. I looked about the room with some curiosity. There was a shaded lamp which threw a circle of brilliant light on a heap of papers lying on an old brass-bound secretaire of the last century. But the room was all vague and shadowy, and I could only see that it was long and low, and that it was filled with indistinct objects, which might be furniture. Mr. Mathias sat down in a second armchair and looked about him with that odd smile of his. He was a queer-looking man, clean-shaven and white to the lips. I should think his age was something between 50 and 60. "Now I've got you here," he began, "I must inflict my hobby on you. You knew I was a collector. Oh yes, I've devoted many years to collecting curiosities, which I think are really curious. But we must have a better light." He advanced into the middle of the room and lit a lamp which hung from the ceiling, and as the bright light flashed around the wick, from every corner and space there seemed to start a horror. Great wooden frames with complicated apparatus of ropes and pulleys stood against the wall. A wheel of strange shape had a place beside a thing that looked like a gigantic gridiron. Little tables glittered with bright steel instruments, carelessly put down as if ready for use. A screw and vise loomed out, casting ugly shadows, and in another look was a saw with a cruel jagged edge. "Yes," Mr. Mathias said, "they are, as you suggest, instruments of torture and death. Some, many, I may say, have been used. A few are reproductions after ancient examples. Those knives were used for flaying. That frame is a rack and a very fine specimen. Look at this. It comes from Venice. You see that sort of collar, something like a big horseshoe? Well, the patient, let us call him, sat down quite comfortably, and the horseshoe was fitted neatly around his neck. Then the two ends were joined with a silken band, the executioner began to turn a handle connected with the band. The horseshoe contracted very gradually as the band tightened, and the turning continued till the man was strangled. It all took place quietly in one of those queer garrets under the Leads. But these things are all European. The Orientals are, of course, much more ingenious. These are the Chinese contrivances. Have you heard of the heavy death? It's my hobby, this sort of thing. Do you know, I often sit here, hour after hour, and meditate over the collection. I fancy I see the faces of the men who have suffered, faces lean with agony and wet with sweats of death, growing distinct out of the gloom. And I hear the echoes of their cries for mercy. But I must show you my latest acquisition. Come into the next room. I followed Mr. Mathias out. The weariness of the walk, the late hour, and the strangeness of it all, it made me feel like a man in a dream. Nothing would have surprised me very much. The second room was, as the first, crowded with ghastly instruments, but beneath the lamp was a wooden platform and a figure stood on it. It was a large statue of a naked woman, fashioned in green bronze. The arms were stretched out, and there was a smile on the lips. It might well have been intended for a Venus, and yet there was about the thing an evil and deadly look. Mr. Mathias looked at it complacently. "Quite a work of art, isn't it?" he said. "It's made of bronze, as you see, but it has had the name of Iron Maid. I got it from Germany, and it was only unpacked this afternoon. Indeed, I've not yet had time to open the letter of advice. You see that very small knob between the breasts? Well, the victim was bound to the maid. The knob was pressed, and the arms slowly tightened around the neck. Can you imagine the result?" As Mr. Mathias talked, he patted the figure affectionately. I'd turned away, for I sickened at the sight of the man and his loathsome treasure. There was a slight click, of which I took no notice. It was not much louder than the tick of a clock. And then I heard a sudden whir, the noise of machinery in motion, and I faced round. I've never forgotten the hideous agony on Mathias' face, as those relentless arms tightened around his neck. There was a wild struggle, as of a beast in the toils, and then a shriek that ended in a choking groan. The whirring noise had suddenly changed into a heavy droning. I tore with all my might at the bronze arms and strove to wrench them apart, but I could do nothing. The head had slowly bent down, and the green lips were on the lips of Mathias. Of course I had to attend the inquest. The letter which had accompanied the figure was found unopened on the study table. The German firm of dealers cautioned their client to be most careful in touching the Iron Maid, as the machinery had been put in thorough working order.
Chilling tales for dark nights.